Hey there, sleepy traveler. Tonight, we're wandering gently back about 3,000 years or so to a place of sun-warmed limestone and the occasional gust of dignified sand. That's right, ancient Egypt. But don't worry, this isn't the story of pyramids being built under whips or dramatic curses in sealed tombs. No. Tonight, we visit the soft, ceremonial stillness of a pharaoh's daily life. A life not of thrilling conquest, but of carefully scheduled calm. Before we proceed, I encourage you to dim the lights, maybe slide under something comfortably worn, like that blanket that smells a bit like your childhood couch. Perhaps even turn on a fan, not for coolness, but for the sort of background hum a palace scribe might have longed for while recording a royal inventory of barley. You are now the pharaoh. Congratulations. No need to bow. You've already risen from divine stock, possibly via an awkwardly worded myth involving sky gods and a beetle or two. Your name is carved on temple walls. Your sandals are gently dusted by servants, and your daily decisions include selecting which shade of blue best pleases the Nile gods today. Exciting, I know. The day begins with sunlight not bursting in, but oozing politely through carved stone lattice windows. These windows do not open because air conditioning in the ancient Egyptian context was simply the hope that the stone stayed cooler than the outside air. Your chamber is vast and echoing, yet somehow smaller than the reputation you've inherited. There's a slight scent of date oil in the air, and someone somewhere is already preparing your morning incense, likely with a very straight face and a slight cough. Your first task: sitting up. Carefully, majestically. It takes about 4 servants to coordinate your linen layers into what might generously be called a regal heap. Your pillow is not made of feathers, but wood, because apparently that was good for posture, or penance, or perhaps simply tradition. Outside your window, the city stirs, but quietly. There's no traffic, no honking, just the occasional bray of a donkey who has opinions about breakfast. Somewhere, a potter begins spinning a wheel that sounds suspiciously like a bored frog. These are the sounds of Egypt, the kind that whisper rather than shout. Breakfast arrives not as a meal, but as a sequence. First, water poured over your hands into a basin that has likely been owned by at least 3 previous pharaohs. Then, a small plate of flatbread figs and something that might be goat cheese, but could also be ceremonial paste. You nibble with the grace of someone aware that the gods might be watching, and they are notoriously judgmental about table manners. As you chew thoughtfully, your vizier enters, not with dramatic flair, but with the energy of someone who has read 3 scrolls already and wishes to be anywhere but beneath a golden ceiling. He bows, not too low. His back is sore from years of tax calculations. He informs you that today you must bless a canal, review a list of acceptable scarab shapes, and sit through a particularly long poem about grain. You nod, majestically. There's no rush. In ancient Egypt, nothing is urgent, except possibly flooding, and thus begins your day. But don't worry. It gets even less exciting after breakfast, or the approximation of 1. You rise well, you are raised. A pair of servants, both professionally silent and mildly hunched from years of regal lifting, help you into your ceremonial sandals. They're more symbolic than functional, with straps that exist solely to be adjusted during important pauses. As you stand, a breeze of papyrus-scented air drifts in from the corridor. It's not refreshing exactly, but it is air, and in this climate, that's often enough. You begin your slow walk to the morning's central event, a ceremonial blessing of a newly cleared irrigation canal. This canal, like all good canals, was designed not only to move water, but also to reinforce your divine connection to the Nile. The Nile, in case you've forgotten, is not just a river. It is a living God with opinions, and those opinions are often best flattered with processions. You proceed down the main hall of the palace at a pace that can only be described as deliberately unimpressive. Each step echoes faintly, despite the soft rush matting laid down by the matting-laying servant, whose job title is too long to repeat here. Along the way, priests bow. Nobles nod. One of them sneezes, then immediately looks terrified. You keep walking. You've been taught that a pharaoh never acknowledges a sneeze. It encourages familiarity. Outside, the sun greets you like an old friend you can't quite remember if you owe a favor. Your entourage is already assembled 20 or so functionaries in linen robes of various shades of beige, each carrying something you won't need, but that looks impressive from a distance. They follow you across a courtyard that radiates a warmth best described as unrelenting. You pause before a plinth where a small, glistening scarab statue awaits. It has been positioned atop a ceremonial stand, flanked by offerings of barley palm wine and what appears to be a mildly confused duck. This is part of the canal blessing. The scarab represents transformation, rebirth, and paperwork. You are handed a ceremonial rod, gilded, of course, and heavier than necessary. With a subtle gesture that took weeks to learn, and even longer to forget, You wave it gently above the offerings. The duck looks concerned. The priests begin to chant slowly in a rhythm that seems intentionally designed to avoid inspiring any particular feeling. Their tones rise and fall like a camel thinking about sitting down. Incense curls in the air, forming abstract suggestions of divine approval. At the climax of the chant, you are meant to pour a jug of blessed water into the canal inlet. This water was collected at dawn from the Nile and filtered through 3 layers of linen by a man who has never once been thanked for it. You lift the jug. Everyone watches. You pour. The water splashes with the enthusiasm of a sigh. The canal accepts the offering with passive dignity. Somewhere, a papyrus is signed. You nod again, less majestically now. Your wrist is sore. But before you can retreat to the shaded part of the courtyard, where a small chair with decorative lion legs has been placed for exactly this moment, your vizier approaches. He is holding a scroll. His face is the exact expression of someone about to deliver news that is both tedious and slightly embarrassing. Your radiance, he says, clearing his throat in the quiet way that makes everyone else immediately pretend to cough. There is a matter concerning the royal scarab collection. It appears there is a discrepancy in orientation. You blink once with measured gravitas. He continues. One of the newly minted ceremonial scarabs was engraved with the sunrise lotus facing westward, not eastward as prescribed by the 3rd tablet of acceptable symbology. You pause. You were not aware there was a 3rd tablet. You are in fact vaguely certain the tablet was invented this morning. But protocol is protocol, and the sun does indeed rise in the east. Or so you've been told. You summon the artisan responsible. He arrives swiftly, which is suspicious. His sandals are dusty, and he's sweating more than the duck. He bows so low that his forehead touches the sun-baked stone, and you briefly wonder if he will fuse with it. It was a misinterpretation, he whispers. The lotus was modeled after the reflection in the water. The westward bloom is metaphorical. This is not helpful. You glance at your vizier, who has already produced a backup scroll labeled Lotus Policy. You sigh through your nose, the most royal form of exasperation. A decision must be made. The scarab cannot be melted down. It has already been blessed. Nor can it be displayed. It might confuse pilgrims. In the end, you decree that it shall be placed in the temple of abstract interpretations, which is not real, but will now need to be constructed. The artisan bows again. The vizier scribbles. The duck waddles off unnoticed. You retreat to your chair, finally. The lion legs are purely decorative, but oddly comforting. A servant brings a cool cloth for your forehead, which you do not need, but accept. Across the courtyard, musicians begin tuning instruments for the noon offering. You will not be attending. It's the priest's turn to look divine. Instead, you are scheduled to review the upcoming scroll of approved public behaviors during solar eclipses, which includes no less than 17 diagrams of appropriate standing postures. The afternoon awaits calmly, drowsily, with the slow certainty of sandstone eroding. Nothing urgent, nothing loud, just the day continuing. A breeze stirs the linen of your sleeve. It smells faintly of papyrus, or possibly the duck. The breeze, faint as it is, carries the scent of warmed ink and distant palm fronds as you are gently ushered from your lion-legged chair into the Hall of Reading, which, despite its grand columns and high ceilings, smells undeniably like someone left a wax seal too close to a brazier last week and has since denied everything. The vizier, who now seems permanently attached to your shadow, clears his throat once again, an action that has become less about attracting attention and more about marking the passage of time. "The scroll your radiance," he says, unrolling a sheet of tightly wound papyrus as carefully as one might unfurl a very tired snake. The Bureau of Solar Etiquette has finalized its recommendations for behavior during the upcoming eclipse. As the sun prepares to vanish briefly, it is naturally vital that the population remain composed, respectful, and directionally accurate. You nod slowly, not because you agree, but because the nodding saves time, otherwise lost to questions. The vizier lays the scroll flat on the obsidian table before you. It is long, unnecessarily long. A decorative border of miniature sun discs runs along the edge, each featuring slightly different facial expressions, presumably to illustrate emotional range during partial occlusion. At the top, a bold title reads, "Decrees pertaining to the temporary retreat of Ra's visible face." Beneath that 17 illustrated postures, each labeled with both hieroglyphic and phonetic notation, guide the reader in proper eclipse reverence stance. The first involves a forward lean and an upward gaze, but only at a 37-degree angle. The second suggests arms extended palms up, unless one's rank permits otherwise. By the fourth diagram, someone appears to be bowing toward a stone beetle while holding a melon, which may be symbolic or may be a misinterpretation of a fruit market decree mistakenly filed in the solar department. You take a deep, slow breath. The vizier watches. His expression is one of proud anticipation, the kind only found on someone who believes paperwork can actually prevent panic. Your thoughts. golden axis of the sky, he asks. You consider this. Technically, you are the embodiment of Horus on earth, meaning you outrank the sun by divine proxy. Yet every celestial shift requires an administrative response. The scroll is handed off to the royal scribe for replication, which involves 3 apprentices, 2 sharpened reeds, and a small bird trained to peck at errors. You watch for a moment. The bird seems tired. So are you. The next event on your schedule, according to the vizier's backup scroll, yes, there's a backup, is the inspection of the temple storage annex. It is not your favorite building. The annex is shaped like a square, trying to be a rectangle, and located just far enough from the palace to justify sandals, but not far enough to enjoy the walk. Nevertheless, protocol calls, and so do the storage priests, whose responsibilities include the categorization dusting and occasional emotional reassessment of thousands of ritual objects no one remembers the purpose of. Your procession reforms itself with the sleepy precision of a chorus that has rehearsed far too often. 2 priests lead the way with large ostrich feather fans, though the air they generate is mostly for show, wafting past your ears with all the refreshing quality of warm soup. Behind you, a servant carries your ceremonial staff, carved with motifs of papyrus crocodiles, and something that might be a disgruntled frog, though no one is brave enough to confirm. Upon arrival, the head of storage, a man with the posture of a bundled scroll, and a voice like someone who once yawned and never stopped, greets you with a bow that nearly becomes a nap. Your celestial stillness, he murmurs, we welcome you to the sanctified collection of non-categorized offerings. He leads you inside. The annex is filled with rows of shelves, jars, amulets, and statues. Everything smells faintly of dust, old incense, and the past 3 festivals. A statue of Bastet winks from behind a curtain of cobwebs. A pile of ceremonial sandals is labeled possibly used by the ancestors, possibly not. There's a corner dedicated to miscarved ankhs, which, due to a typo, became symbols for small, tired boat instead of life eternal. You walk slowly, nodding occasionally. At one point, a priest lifts the lid of a storage chest to reveal an alarming number of beetle-shaped combs. These were meant for the festival of hair and harvest, he explains unconvincingly. The vizier scribbles notes. You pause before a jar, labeled simply, unspecified oils, smelled important. You do not ask. The annex is equal parts museum broom closet and bureaucratic shrine. As you continue, a distant gong sounds softly, and several notes off-key. That means it's the 4th hour of daylight since incense was last burned. Time for a scent refresh. A servant steps forward with a brazier, and a bundle of herbs fumbles slightly, then recovers with the grace of someone who has burned a toga before and will not do it again. The aroma changes. Now the air smells like heated myrrh sand and well-intentioned tradition. The vizier returns with yet another scroll, this one mercifully short. There is to be a debate held this evening in the hall of measured voices, he says, regarding the standardization of camel shade rankings. You do not react. The debate, as you recall, stems from a dispute between two desert outposts over whether a particular camel should be classified as soft dusk or worn ochre. The issue apparently affects grain transport fees. You sigh internally. It is almost time for your noon repose, the quiet hour when the sun sits directly above, and even the palace cats pause to reconsider existence. You nod one last time at the storage priests, who begin carefully rotating the misaligned scarab from earlier back to face east, just in case. You step out into the courtyard, where the light has taken on a slightly lazier tone, and your sandals make soft, contemplative slaps against the sun-warmed stone. A servant offers you a date, which you accept mostly to avoid further conversation. Somewhere nearby, a flute begins to play a tune that may or may not be about irrigation. The air thickens gently, and the vizier is already consulting another scroll as you make your way toward your private resting alcove, which is not a room, not exactly, but a curtained-off portion of the palace cloister, arranged specifically for looking thoughtful while horizontal. It contains a low wooden bench polished to a ceremonial shine, a reed mat that creaks when no one touches it, and a single cushion that has somehow remained exactly as lumpy as it was when it was presented to your grandfather as a gift from a minor Nubian dignitary with a fondness for coarse stuffing. You settle in, or more accurately, are tucked in 3 servants performing the traditional folding of the repose shawl, which requires 12 precise creases and a whispered blessing to the god of partial naps. The vizier, ever hovering like a well-dressed vulture of logistics, stands at a respectable distance, scroll in hand, waiting for the moment your eyes close so he can resume talking. You do not close them. Not yet. Instead, you stare upward at the painted ceiling, a depiction of the heavens that includes stars, constellations, and a rather optimistic comet trail added last year by an enthusiastic apprentice. It is by all accounts restful, or it would be were it not for the faint sound of someone loudly unrolling yet another scroll somewhere nearby. your radiance. The vizier begins as the sun reaches its apogee and casts minimal shadows. May I gently remind you of this evening's scheduled discourse. The matter of standardized camel hue terminology has reached the level of minor civic unrest. You exhale, which, in pharaonic body language, is equivalent to a small parade of reluctant approval. The vizier continues. There are currently 4 factions. One supports the term soft dusk, arguing that it properly reflects the camel's pelt under late-day lighting. Another insists on worn ochre, citing trade documentation precedent. A third faction proposes a compromise term, desert honey, though that has upset the honey guild. And a fourth group, mostly herdsmen, demand that we stop naming camels entirely as they find it. Delays hog feeding schedules. You adjust your shawl slightly. It is the most comfortable part of your day, and now it's wrapped in beige politics. Still, this is governance. You rise with the slowness of one performing a religious rite that may or may not involve stretching. A basin is brought for your hands, a mint-scented cloth for your brow, and a ceremonial sandal polisher who has nothing to polish but insists on brushing invisible dust in elaborate circles. By the time you stand fully resettled into upright importance, the debate has already begun assembling across the courtyard in the hall of measured voices. As halls go, it is unimpressive in size, but daunting in echo. Every sound in that room bounces back with the tone of someone disagreeing. Designed for discourse, the chamber's architecture ensures that even polite murmurings return to the speaker with the timbre of dissent. You step into the hall beneath a tall arch inscribed with the phrase, "Wisdom requires stillness," unless someone is wrong, and proceed to your appointed chair, a carved affair flanked by modest lion heads and exactly 2 armrests, one for authority and one for symbolic forethought. Representatives of each faction stand ready. They wear robes of similar cut but wildly different accessory philosophies. The soft dusk delegation wears sashes dyed with crushed rose petals, while the worn ochre team has opted for earth-toned beads and a general air of defensive superiority. The desert honey advocate, a young bureaucrat named Nepharun, who speaks like he's reading from a dream, carries with him a dried fig as a prop. No one knows why. The herdsmen, all sandal, and no flare, carry the expressions of men who have argued with camels and survived. The vizier steps forward to moderate. His voice, while monotone, has the curious power of stilling even the most enthusiastic protester. His radiance will now preside over the deliberation. Present your assertions with due reverence. Interruptions will be recorded and preserved in the hall of misjudged sentences. The first speaker from soft dusk steps forward. He unfurls a parchment and begins reading an ode to sunset light falling upon fur. The second line rhymes radiant with gradient, and everyone pretends not to notice. He gestures to a painted clay model of a camel mid-chew. The worn ochre spokesman responds by referencing trade receipts from 7 years prior and a particularly dry season that apparently tanned the local herd to a more ochre-forward hue. He finishes with a dramatic pause and a reference to tradition that no one can verify. Neferun the desert. Honeyman speaks in metaphors. The camel, he says, is the desert's whisper, and whispers deserve names, dipped in sweetness. He holds up the fig. No one reacts. The herdsmen speak last. Their spokesperson, a leathery man named Hotef, simply says, "If it walks, it eats." Call it what you want. Just do it fast. You sit silent, majestic, unmoved. Behind your expression, however, your thoughts are carefully arranging themselves like pots on a market shelf. You consider the implications. Soft dusk appeals to aesthetics. Worn ochre to record-keeping. Desert honey to no one in particular, and the herdsman to practicality. Somewhere a solution exists, or at least a way to name things without naming them. You raise your hand slightly. The hall quiets. The vizier leans forward, poised to translate whatever decree may pass your lips. You open your mouth not to speak, but to inhale in that particularly royal way that suggests a proclamation is brewing. Outside, the sun begins its slow descent, brushing the sky with colors that, depending on one's leanings, could be described as dusty, honeyed ochre or something else entirely. And within that dimming glow, a servant rushes in through a side door, breathless, clutching a scroll marked with the seal of the high temple of Ra. He bows so quickly he nearly somersaults, then holds the scroll aloft, trembling. Your radiance. He gasps. An urgent matter has arrived from the temple regarding the ceremonial sun disk scheduled for tomorrow's procession of light. The servant's scroll quivers slightly in his grasp, as though the urgency of its contents is radiating through the parchment and up his arms. His robe is damp with effort, sandals scuffed from what must have been a determined jog across sunlit courtyards and unreasonably decorative colonnades. He kneels, presenting the message with the trembling reverence typically reserved for divine visions or extremely confusing omens. You accept the scroll with a slow, deliberate motion that communicates supreme calm while internally preparing yourself for the sort of minor ceremonial crisis that consumes an entire evening, and usually involves the relocation of a large object. The seal on the scroll is unmistakable. The stylized eye of Ra, etched with alarming precision and faint hints of judgment. You break it cleanly, unroll the message, and begin to read carefully, though not too slowly, lest anyone think you require assistance. It begins, as most temple notices do, with 4 lines of formal blessing, 3 of which invoke your own name in slightly different inflections, followed by the main body of text, which, despite its florid calligraphy, gets to the point by the 3rd paragraph. The ceremonial sun disk centerpiece of tomorrow's procession of light has suffered what the temple describes as a cosmic misalignment, a phrase which turns out, upon closer inspection, to mean that a very large, very circular, golden disk has developed a noticeable dent. The letter elaborates that the disk traditionally mounted atop a wheeled altar and pulled through the temple courtyard by 12 shaved oxen was being polished by a novice priest named Ipu. When in an attempt to reach the rear panel, he lost his footing, fell forward, and landed with his full weight, enhanced by a bundle of prayer scrolls strapped to his back, squarely onto the artifact. The resulting dent is not sharp, but prominent, and according to the attached diagram, vaguely resembles the profile of a slightly alarmed ibis. The high priest of Ra has written to inform you that while the disk is technically intact and still capable of catching sunlight at approved angles, its altered surface may cause the reflections to scatter in a manner inconsistent with prior years. This may confuse the faithful, offend the sun god, or worst of all, cause the sacred oxen to hesitate mid-procession, which in turn could delay the chanting schedule. You lower the scroll. The hall is still. The representatives of the Camel Color Council glance at one another with the awkward realization that their heated debate may have just been superseded by a literal dent. The vizier steps forward, eyebrows raised to the level marked imminent committee formation. "Shall I summon the Temple Artisans Guild?" he asks. You nod, then wave a hand toward the camel delegations. Inform them that the matter is to be tabled until the next favorable eclipse. Let the color remain. Fluid, you add, selecting a term vague enough to satisfy everyone and specific enough to be cited later as a ruling. The delegates bow, even the herdsman. Nepharun drops his fig, which is ignored by all, including a cat that had been eyeing it with mild disdain. The vizier turns to a nearby scribe and whispers something that sends the boy sprinting out of the chamber, presumably toward the artisan's quarters. You, meanwhile, remain seated, scroll in hand, eyes unfocused, as the gears of royal protocol creak into motion around you. Within the hour, the Temple Artisans Guild assembles in the northern courtyard, where emergency repairs are deemed most auspicious. You are escorted there in quiet procession, the mood appropriately solemn. The damaged sun disk has already been delivered, and now lies under a linen canopy surrounded by 4 carpenters, 3 goldsmiths, and 1 sculptor, whose presence is more symbolic than practical. The dent is indeed unfortunate, catching the mid-afternoon light in a way that accentuates its irregularity. One artisan describes it carefully as emotionally asymmetrical. Another suggests that it might be incorporated into the design, perhaps, by engraving a stylized wing motif to balance the contour. A third proposes simply turning the disc to face the other way and pretending the dent is part of the stand. You listen. You nod. You inhale thoughtfully, all the while aware that Ipu, the novice priest responsible for the mishap, is kneeling a short distance away, head bowed, forehead nearly touching the hot stone. His shoulders are rigid, his robe streaked with polish, and his aura exuding the particular flavor of panic only available to those who have personally offended a celestial body. The high priest of Ra arrives soon after, flanked by 2 attendants who carry nothing but tall staffs and inscrutable expressions. He bows deeply, but not too deeply. He is, after all, the earthly representative of the sun's divine will, and not prone to casual deference. Your radiance. He intones, the temple accepts full responsibility for the unfortunate blemish upon Ra's visage. However, we believe this to be a test of composure, a chance to reaffirm devotion through imperfection. You stare at him. Behind his eyes, you can see the subtle flicker of desperation, a man hoping that philosophical interpretation can be weaponized against accountability. You glance at Ipu. He hasn't moved. The artisan's weight chisels, stilled polishing cloths dangling in the still air. You make your decision, and with a voice practiced in both monotony and metaphor, you declare that the sun itself is eternal, and no dent upon a disk can diminish its power. However, you add the reflection of that power must be worthy of those who witness it. Therefore, the disk shall be reshaped, not remade. Its dent shall become deliberate, its outline recast into a symbol of vigilance, the eye of unblinking patience. Ipu will be reassigned, not punished for his fall, was sincere, but relocated to the temple of quiet duties, where scroll maintenance and corridor sweeping await. The high priest nods slowly, pretending this is exactly what he'd hoped for. The artisans bow and begin murmuring to one another in the language of measurements and gold leaf application. Ipu is led gently away by a kind-faced elder priest who whispers something about footwork. You turn to leave, satisfied that the ceremony will proceed, and that divine optics have been preserved. The sun dips lower, evening rituals loom, and as the shadows lengthen across the courtyard, the vizier approaches once more, a smaller scroll in hand, marked with the purple wax of the royal calendar office. "Your radiance," he murmurs, with the steady dread of someone tasked with scheduling divine processions. "We must discuss the upcoming festival of the moon's second mood." The scroll in the vizier's hand is shorter than most, but his expression suggests the contents are not. You accept it with emotion that could be mistaken for interest, but is in fact a well-practiced form of resignation wrapped in regal composure. The wax seal of the royal calendar office is pressed slightly off-center, a detail you register without intending to file away, with the knowledge that the calendar scribe has a crooked thumb and a love of late lunches. You unroll the scroll slowly, buying a few precious seconds of silence before the inevitable, and begin to read the carefully worded notice regarding the upcoming festival of the moon's second mood. According to the text written in ceremonial passive voice, to avoid assigning blame, the timing of the festival has fallen into dispute. The traditional observance occurs on the second full moon, following the fifth flooding omen, provided it coincides with the seventh palm fronds shadow falling westward before noon. This year, however, due to unusual cloud behavior and an unseasonal flock of ibis disrupting standard shadow measurements, the seventh palm frond's shade fell eastward by what the scribe describes as a whisker of uncertainty. This has prompted a division among the temple astronomers. One faction claims the moon is in her reflective mood, best suited for quiet observance and polished statues, while another insists this is clearly her celebratory mood, demanding drums, honey cakes, and the ritual tossing of perfumed feathers from the palace balcony. The scroll closes with a request for clarification from your radiance, specifically asking whether the moon shall be addressed with reverence or rhythm. You lower the scroll and gaze out toward the horizon, where the sun has begun to slide beneath the palm line, and the sky holds that pale shimmer of dusk that implies all decisions should have been made hours ago. The vizier remains still a wax tablet, now balanced on his palm, in case you choose to dictate an immediate response. You don't. Instead, you gesture to the western gallery, where the temple astronomers are likely to be assembling in preparation for the nightly review of celestial happenings. A ritual which typically involves 6 debates, 4 star maps, and at least one awkwardly silent moment when someone realizes they've been tracking Venus backwards. You make your way there, passing through a colonnade where stone lions observe your passage with the same expression they've had for centuries, mildly bored, but loyal. As you approach the gallery, you hear the soft scrape of sandals and the occasional cough of scholarly anxiety. Inside, the astronomers have already begun murmuring among themselves, each cradling a wax slate filled with calculations that to the untrained eye resemble doodles of very angular crocodiles. They bow as you enter, not deeply, but deeply enough to satisfy the formal requirements. The lead astronomer, an elder named Jeru, who speaks in gentle riddles even when discussing rainfall steps forward. O radiant decider of moods, he begins, we seek your guidance in matters lunar and emotional. You nod. Jeru elaborates. The reflective mood, he explains, is indicated when the moon's surface glows with a pale hue and her northern crescent appears as if wrapped in silk. It is a time for introspection, low fires, and long poems written without verbs. The celebratory mood, by contrast, emerges when the moon rises briskly and appears to smile, or at least smirk, above the horizon. That moon, Jeru claims, wants music. You glance at the sky through the gallery's open dome. The moon, nearly full, hangs there with an expression that could be interpreted as thoughtful or amused depending on the angle. You ask slowly what last year's decision had been. Jeru hesitates, then answers, last year, the moon was considered celebratory. There were dances. One of the dancers fell into a decorative fountain. The records call it mirthful splashing. You turn to the junior astronomers who have wisely remained quiet and ask if the moon's behavior this year is any different. One of them, a young woman with ink-stained fingers and a feather quill tucked behind her ear, pipes up. The smile is smaller, she says, then immediately looks as though she regrets speaking. You consider this. A smaller smile. Not no smile. Not a frown. Perhaps a smirk of reserved approval. You declare that the moon is in a measured mood, a middle ground between reflective and celebratory. The festival shall proceed, but drums shall be muffled, and the honey cakes shall be round, but not extravagant. The perfumed feathers shall be tossed, but only in even numbers. The astronomers nod, impressed. Jeru declares this interpretation most harmonious, and scribes begin translating your decree into poetic verse for public distribution. You turn to leave, but the vizier steps forward again, this time holding a fresh clay tablet with a hasty inscription. There is one more concern. Your radiance, he says. The royal drum master has filed a protest. He insists that his troupe has been rehearsing for the celebratory mood, and that their rhythms are unsuitable for a measured one. You blink slowly. The royal drum master, a man named Menhotep, is known for his devotion to volume and his personal belief that all emotions can be expressed through increasingly rapid tempo. You sigh inwardly, of course, and instruct that Menhotep be summoned for a private audience. Within the hour, he arrives wearing a robe embroidered with tiny bronze bells that jingle in defiance of your measured mood decree. He bows deeply and begins an impassioned explanation about the sacred nature of rhythmic consistency and the dishonor of altering a beat mid-season. You listen, then raise one hand. Compose a measured rhythm, you say, one that honors restraint, but does not insult the pulse. Menhotep blinks. A rhythm of hesitation, he asks, a drum beat that wonders if it should continue. You nod. He bows again, this time in understanding. It shall be called the cautious celebration, he murmurs, already tapping out the ghost of a pattern on his forearm. He leaves. The moon rises higher, the stars flicker into place, and the night prepares for its own kind of quiet pageantry. You turn back toward the palace, where the festival's sleeping arrangements must now be reviewed, since certain guests have expressed concern that the moon's current mood may cause their rooms to receive either too much or too little symbolic light. The vizier clears his throat with the gentle menace of someone holding yet another scroll. And your radiance, he adds softly. There is the matter of the sacred beetle race scheduled for dawn. There appears to be a dispute over the wax used to polish the starting line. The sacred beetle race, as the vizier reminds you in a tone that suggests he'd rather not, is an annual tradition older than most walls in the palace, and revered with a sincerity that belies its basic premise, which is this small sacred scarab. Beetles, hand-selected by the Temple of Steady Movement, are placed behind a ceremonial starting line, drawn in chalk, mixed with crushed lapis and optimism, and encouraged to roll spheres of dung equally blessed and meticulously weighed across a stretch of sun-dappled courtyard, while high priests chant a rhythm so slow it barely registers as motion. The first beetle to reach the finish line is not declared a winner, for competition is unseemly among divine symbols, but instead honored as the most motivated representation of cyclical effort, a title that comes with a wreath of dried lotus petals and a generous sprinkle of barley on its favorite rolling hill. The problem this year, as outlined on the freshly baked clay tablet in the vizier's hands, involves the polishing wax used on the sacred starting tiles. Two separate temple maintenance crews, apparently unaware of each other's assignments, applied different waxes to alternating squares. 1. A traditional blend of beeswax and ground myrrh, favored for its mild scent and devotional stickiness. The other, a newer concoction involving palm resin and an imported citrus peel favored by young scribes who believe ancient beetles enjoy a bit of zing. The result is a starting line of varying traction, causing last evening's practice run to end in chaos when several beetles veered dramatically to the left. One spun in a slow, dignified circle, and another climbed atop its sphere and refused to descend, achieving an unintentional moment of spiritual symbolism that no one was prepared to interpret. The Temple of Steady Movement has requested immediate clarification. Should the wax be unified to honor consistency or left mismatched to represent life's unpredictable surface? You ponder this as you walk with measured pace through the palace garden toward the courtyard in question. The path lined with stone jars of herbs that smell of sensible choices and time-consuming rituals. The vizier walks half a step behind, as always ready to produce more tablets should further beetle-based revelations occur. You arrive at the courtyard to find a small gathering already present. Priests in tan robes, their belts embroidered with golden thread in the pattern of gently rolling spheres, murmuring quietly as several beetles are gently repositioned by attendants using special sticks carved with beetle-friendly symbols. The starting line gleams unevenly in the setting moonlight, each tile a miniature reflection of intent and accident. One priest approaches, bowing slightly, then introduces himself as Keeper of the Line, a title that appears to come with a sash and a faint look of apology. He explains politely but firmly that the sacred beetles are sensitive to footing, and that last year's winner, known colloquially as Nimble Six Legs, has developed a preference for the myrrh blend, which encourages linear ambition. Another priest, slightly younger, and wearing a pendant in the shape of a very enthusiastic beetle, argues that unpredictability in terrain fosters adaptability in spirit, and that the race should reflect the complexity of divine burden. You listen to both arguments while observing a nearby beetle that appears to be meditating. It does not move, does not roll, simply rests beside its sphere as though contemplating the futility of forward motion. You admire its composure. After a moment, you speak. The path shall be divided, not randomly, but intentionally, you declare. Let the left half be polished in myrrh, the right in citrus. Each beetle shall choose its lane. In this choice, let it reveal its preferred philosophy. The priests nod slowly, realizing they now must explain this to the crowd with at least 2 allegories and a song. The Keeper of the Line bows again and scurries off to repolish the tiles according to your decree. The vizier, already scribbling notes, asks quietly whether an announcement should be prepared for dawn. You nod. Let the people know their pharaoh sees wisdom even in the path of a scarab. As you turn to leave the courtyard, one of the attendants chases after a beetle that has decided to explore a crack in the paving stones, prompting a flurry of robes and a brief, whispered debate on whether pursuing a rogue beetle during the festival constitutes disrespect or just dedication. You allow yourself a small internal smile. It will be an interesting race. Back inside the palace is settling into its nighttime rhythm. Soft torchlight flickering against painted walls. The distant sound of a reed flute playing a melody that might be devotional or might simply be someone practicing in hopes of being mistaken for divine inspiration. A servant brings you a clay cup of warm date milk, a beverage favored for its soothing properties and faint suggestion of being nutritious. You drink slowly, aware that once it's finished, the evening's final audience awaits the scribes of the Royal Chronicle, who have requested your ruling on whether this year's events should be recorded in the gold ink of fortunate cycles or the blue ink of circumstantial oddities. The choice, as always, will shape how this week is remembered by generations of school children and bored temple guides. You hand the empty cup to a nearby attendant and make your way toward the archive hall, where the chroniclers wait with open scrolls, sharpened reeds, and the slightly nervous anticipation of those who know that ink once chosen dries very quickly. As you enter the hall, the scent of papyrus and lamp oil greets you like an old proverb. The head scribe, a woman with a braid so long it has its own shadow, bows deeply and lifts her tablet. Your radiance, she begins, we humbly await your ink. And from somewhere deep in the palace, perhaps the kitchen or the lesser courtyard, there comes the unmistakable thump of a ceremonial drum being tested too early by someone who cannot count to dawn without tapping on something first. The thump echoes just faintly through the vaulted ceilings of the archive hall, barely enough to disturb the orderly stacks of rolled scrolls or shift the layer of settled dust upon the oldest volumes, but enough, just enough, to cause a synchronized twitch in the posture of the royal chroniclers. Each scribe, previously poised in reverent stillness, glances up for the briefest of moments toward the domed ceiling, as though uncertain whether the sound was divine punctuation or the unmistakable misstep of an impatient drummer. The head scribe, her long braid tucked over one shoulder, like a coiled scroll itself, composes herself before speaking again. Your radiance, she says, holding the pair of ceremonial ink flasks with the gravity of someone offering alternate fates. This cycle of days may be recorded in gold or blue. The former speaks to providence, a season of harmony and ritual precision. The latter acknowledges irregularities, unexpected truths, and beetles that refuse to roll forward. You pause, though not from indecision. Rather, it is a pause filled with observational weight. You glance slowly at the flasks, gold ink shimmering faintly warm and traditional, while blue ink holds a cooler luster like moonlight over damp stone and smells faintly of fermented lotus. Both have merit. Both tell stories. But this week has been neither purely fortunate nor particularly orderly. The dented sun disk, the waxed checkerboard of beetle lanes, the musical moderation demanded of Menhotep, the moon's uncertain smirk, all form a narrative, not of chaos, but of managed peculiarities. You speak softly, but clearly. Let it be blue. The head scribe nods, and the others set to work, dipping their reeds into the thoughtful ink, and beginning to trace the week's events in long, looping script. They murmur dates to one another, verify spellings of minor temple names, and debate briefly about whether a recently mentioned duck should be named in the record or left as an anonymous waterfowl. As they write, you drift slowly toward the chamber's side alcove, where murals of past festivals stretch in gentle, chronological order. Each painted scene is a study in dignified repetition. Rows of dancers, mid-pose priests lifting identical jars, and pharaohs, nearly indistinguishable from one another, save for slight differences in beard angle. You pause before the most recent depiction, where your own likeness is rendered atop a platform, arm raised in what the artist called a blessing. But what you remember was an attempt to shield your eyes from an unexpected cloudburst. Behind you, a scribe clears her throat. "Your radiance," she says carefully. "A messenger from the temple of rhythmic observation has arrived. He claims urgent need for guidance regarding the percussion protocol." You turn nod once, and within moment, a young man in a robe too large for his shoulders is ushered into the hall. He bows too deeply, then too quickly, rises, and nearly upsets a low table holding ink drying stones. "Forgive my haste," he says, "but Master Menhotep's drummers are growing uncertain." They rehearse the cautious celebration, yet some feel the pattern lacks adequate emphasis on sacred crescendos. There is disagreement over how many beats constitute respectful hesitation. You inhale. The matter of rhythm, once considered the domain of instinct and informal tapping, has now spiraled into theological nuance. You motion for the boy to follow and lead him down a side corridor toward the palace's sound chamber, a rounded room of polished stone and intentional echoes used mostly to test acoustics and on rare occasions to shout deeply personal declarations in a controlled environment. Inside, Menhotep himself is already present, surrounded by a semicircle of drummers, tapping rhythmically on animal skin drums of varying tone and conviction. They stop. As you enter, some leaping to their feet, others merely straightening their posture, as if a drumbeat interrupted carries divine weight. Your radiance. Menhotep begins. We have shaped the rhythm as instructed. It reflects moderation, measured joy, and the dignity of a festival held during a moon of uncertain smiling. But some argue he pauses to cast a glance at a beardless drummer who appears to have recently arrived from enthusiasm rather than experience, that a pause between measures, longer than the pause before a camel's sneeze, lacks meaning. You blink slowly. The drummer in question clears his throat and offers, "I only meant that too much." Pause can be mistaken for forgetting. You walk to the center of the chamber. A small stool, carved with beetle legs, has been placed there likely by someone hoping the symbolism might transfer clarity. You do not sit. Instead, you speak. Let the first beat fall firmly, the second softer, and the third unplayed. That which is not struck shall carry the weight of expectation. And then you pause just long enough. Let the fourth strike remind us we are still here. The room falls into respectful silence, then tentative nods. Menhotep bows deeply. The rhythm of absence, he murmurs. A beat defined by the one that isn't. You leave them to rehearse, and the pattern begins anew firm, soft, nothing, firm again. A sequence that seems to hold its own sort of breath. Outside, the moon has tilted slightly higher now, its smirk more confident. You return to the main hall, where the vizier awaits, leaning slightly against a pillar, not out of fatigue, but the solemn recognition that the day is not yet over. Your radiance, he says, not bothering to unroll the scroll in his hand, because he knows, you know, he's holding one. There has been a development regarding the festival's ceremonial torchbearer. The candidate selected has been found to be left-handed, and the scroll of ember etiquette specifies the torch must be lifted in the right. A correction must be made, or an amendment proposed. There is also concern from the Guild of Torchsmiths regarding the ashfall radius of this year's flame cone design. And lastly, a small delegation of goats has wandered into the amphora storage. You exhale, not audibly, of course, but with the slow internal release of a ruler who has reached the 9th ceremonial inquiry of the day and still hasn't had time to enjoy even a lukewarm fig cake. The vizier ever balanced between patience and a quiet fear of interruptions, becoming traditions, holds the scroll just close enough for you to see the seal blue wax, which you now associate exclusively with unexpected festival logistics. You don't need to read the scroll to understand the problem. The ceremonial torchbearer, a role both symbolically luminous and exhaustively choreographed, has always been a right-handed position. Not for reasons of safety, fire dynamics, or efficiency, but because an ancient mural one that no one has been able to locate for 3 generations depicted a right-handed bearer raising flame toward a god who no longer receives personal offerings, but still features in official songs. Now, the chosen torchbearer, a young temple acolyte with impressive posture and a flame-resistant robe, has been discovered to favor his left hand. Not mildly, not out of habit, but with the kind of definitive left-handedness that results in dramatically swooping gestures and a refusal to even gesture mildly with the right. This is according to the scroll of ember etiquette, a flame, irregularity, of potential symbolic misalignment. The torch must be lifted, carried and rotated clockwise at the midpoint of the processional route, a maneuver designed centuries ago by someone who likely never met a left-handed person. You consider the options. Retraining the acolyte would take time and introduce hesitation into a movement that must appear effortless. Replacing him would cause offense to the Temple of Light's Apprentice Council, who have already commemorated his selection with a miniature carving and a ceremonial snack tray. Changing the scroll's wording would require 3 high priests and a backup quorum of lunar observers. The vizier awaits your ruling with the stillness of someone who has memorized the torch's wind diffusion specs just in case. The torch shall be carried in the left, you declare after a pause. The bearer shall walk on the opposite side of the route, so the flame faces outward. Let this adjustment be deemed the inverted flame path. Record it as an homage to balance and directional diversity. The vizier nods, relief masked as formality, and makes a note in his ledger. A footnote will be added to next year's edition of the Ember Etiquette. A statue may follow, depending on how smooth the turn looks in daylight. Before the matter can settle fully into memory, a steward approaches, hands clasped nervously in front of him, eyes wide with the kind of urgent uncertainty usually reserved for weather omens or large, unannounced visitors. "Your radiance," he says, regarding the goats. You blink once. The steward continues. 3 goats have wandered into the amphora storage. It appears a delivery gate was left unlatched by the junior keeper of wine. The goats have thus far interacted with 13 amphorae. 4 have been sniffed, 2 lightly nibbled, 1 toppled. The rest have been stared at in a manner that suggests judgment. you are silent. Not because you are shocked, but because this is not your first goat-related complication. During last year's barley festival, a group of goats attempted to interpret the sacred mural sequence and rearranged themselves into what the priests insisted resembled a harvest blessing. The goats were not invited again, but clearly their sense of symbolism persists. You instruct the steward to summon the keeper of storage protocol and the high interpreter of livestock omens. If goats have entered the storage unbidden, it must be determined whether this was an accident, a protest, or heaven help you a divine suggestion. In the meantime, you proceed to the storage yard where the amphorae are stacked in deliberate order beside a wall painted with ancient instructions for grain fermentation, featuring stick figures with surprisingly expressive eyebrows. The goats are indeed there. 3 of them. 1 brown one spotted, 1 alarmingly still. They stand between rows of clay jars, utterly unfazed by the appearance of a dozen palace officials and 2 guards with ceremonial shepherd's crooks. The toppled amphora lies on its side intact, but gently leaking what smells like mid-tier pomegranate wine. The brown goat nudges a shard of cork with what might be mild approval. The high interpreter of livestock omens arrives breathless and already flipping through his vellum pocket guide to goat occurrences and their meanings. According to Chapter 7, he says goats approaching a vessel imply scrutiny. If they taste the contents, it is judgment. If they sit beside the vessel, it is endorsement. If they stare pilently. He glances toward the 3rd goat. Then it is a call for contemplation. You do not respond immediately. Instead, you step forward. The 3rd goat turns its head toward you, unmoving, and maintains eye contact for an uncomfortably long moment. You nod once. Let the amphorae be cleansed and resealed, you say. The wine shall be used in the closing toast of the festival. Let it be said that even goats discern quality. The goat blinks. The crowd bows. Somewhere behind you, a torchbearer practices his reverse-handed pivot with careful resolve. The vizier clears his throat. There remains the matter of the festival's closing chant. Your radiance, he says. The choir leader has proposed adding a 4th stanza referencing the moon's mood. But the assistant cantor believes the melody cannot sustain more than 3 without invoking the dissonance clause. They await your lyrical decision. You turn toward the echoing hallway once more, where the moon continues its careful climb, and where tonight's choices still hum like unstruck drums, waiting for rhythm. The hallway echoes softly beneath your sandals as you make your way toward the choral atrium, where melodies are shaped like clay, and verses tend to grow in number when no one is looking. The vizier follows closely, clutching the annotated scroll of festival music protocol with the quiet intensity of someone who once attempted to edit a chorus during rehearsal and still remembers the sound of 40 singers exhaling at the same time. The atrium itself is acoustically flawless by design, a dome of gentle curvature and smooth stone that allows even whispered notes to bounce back as if blessed. Beneath it, the choir is gathered in 2 uneven rows, one comprised of singers who favor upright posture and long vowels, the other of slightly more experimental types who hum during rests and occasionally harmonize with distant birds. The choir master, a woman named Setepi, stands before them with her ceremonial baton, which is technically a polished reed, but held with such authority that it could conduct lightning if required. She bows upon your entrance, not deeply, but with a crispness that implies both welcome and wariness. Your radiance, she says, we are prepared to perform the festival chant as composed 3 stanzas, each reflecting a celestial element, sun-moon, and the slow turning wheel of seasonal irrigation. You nod. This was the traditional structure, well-worn and rhythmically stable. She continues, however, with the moon's mood so nuanced this cycle, I have composed a 4th stanza, short and reflective, to honor the cautious celebration and the torchbearer's inversion. It follows the 3rd naturally, though the assistant cantor believes the final note will clash with the descending interval and summon in his words a tonal ambiguity. You glance at the assistant cantor, who stands beside a large tuning fork, and the expression of someone who has not enjoyed a performance since early adolescence. He clears his throat. The 4th stanza, he says carefully, resolves neither musically nor spiritually. It leaves the chant in suspension. Some may find that disquieting. You consider the phrasing. In truth, the festival has contained more disquieting elements already. The dented sun disk, the bifurcated beetle race, the goat's spiritual audit. So a bit of tonal ambiguity might be more accurate than disruptive. Still, chants are more than music. They are verbal architecture meant to hold meaning in careful layers, each tone supporting the next like a roof of melodic tile. You ask for a demonstration. The choir prepares breathing in gentle unison, like a field of grain responding to a breeze. The 1st stanza opens with warm consonants invoking the sun's steadiness. The 2nd sways like moonlight on shallow water. The 3rd lifts briefly like a scarab at takeoff. Then the 4th. It begins softly, almost not at all the word scribe, tracing the theme of deliberate motion and unspoken rhythm. The melody does not rise. It drifts sideways, then stops, not abruptly, but with the kind of openness one usually finds in empty courtyards or unfinished thoughts. The silence that follows is not accidental. It settles across the atrium like a veil, not heavy, but undeniable. You stand quietly for a moment longer, watching how the singers lower their heads, how the assistant cantor frowns without quite objecting, how Setepi holds her baton motionless in the air, as if it too is wondering whether it should have done something differently. Include it, you say. Let the chant end in suspension. Let it echo the festival's shape, unresolved, attentive, humble in its uncertainty. Setepi nods once. The assistant cantor bows deeply, which you suspect is his way of retreating from further discussion. The choir begins marking their scores. Accordingly, small clay tablets passed down the line, each receiving a fresh symbol, a note not meant to conclude, but to wait. The vizier scribbles a note in the margin of his protocol scroll, possibly to revisit the definition of closure. As you turn to leave the atrium, the final note of the chant still lingers, not in sound, but in suggestion. It follows you down the hall like a polite question. Night deepens across the palace. Torches have been lit in the outer walkways, casting long, flickering lines on the stone, while shadows stretch into corners with lazy precision. The air smells faintly of roasted grain and recently opened scrolls. You pass a scribe arranging tomorrow's announcements on a display stand shaped like an open palm. He bows, then hesitates. Your radiance. He says a question has arisen among the candle carriers. You stop. This is not unexpected. The candle carriers, responsible for lining the perimeter of the festival path with ceremonial lights, are famously particular. The scribe continues. They wish to know whether the candles for the northern arc should be lit with flame drawn from the sun disk or from the torch of the inverted path. There are symbolic implications. You nod slowly. Flame sources matter. The sun disk is tradition. The inverted torch is this year's innovation. Each would cast the same light, but one carries the weight of generations, the other the mark of thoughtful deviation. You do not answer immediately. Instead, you walk to the nearest outer courtyard, where a single torch burns in quiet isolation. The inverted path bearer's rehearsal flame, lit and tended by a solitary novice who hums softly to himself while watching it flicker. You watch the flame. It dances as flames do, but without urgency. Its light is neither proud nor apologetic, just steady. You decide. Let the northern arc be lit by the inverted path, you say. Let the light turn as the path did toward the people. The scribe bows and retreats quickly, the kind of speed reserved for the urgent transmission of subtle decisions. You remain in the courtyard a moment longer, listening to the quiet, broken only by the soft scrape of a beetle across a stone nearby. Perhaps rehearsing, perhaps lost. You do not move to stop it. The moon has shifted again, the smirk now softened into something closer to amusement. The night is not silent, but it hums in harmony with all that has passed, drums and goats and unplayed notes. And as you prepare to return indoors, the vizier reappears with a look that suggests he is unsure whether to speak or simply offer you a nap. He opts for speaking. Your radiance. He says news has arrived from the Pottery Guild. They request your presence at dawn to evaluate the ceremonial vessel intended for tomorrow's water of renewal. There is concern it may resemble a soup bowl more than a divine basin. You awaken slightly before dawn, not by intention, but by that quiet instinct which tells those in positions of ceremonial consequence that something slightly off-shaped waits to be judged before breakfast. The room is dark, save for a single oil lamp near the door, flickering as if considering retirement, and somewhere beyond the open lattice of your chamber window, the city breathes its soft pre-festival breath. Already distant footsteps can be heard from servants preparing incense and drummers quietly practicing the rhythm of absence with just enough discipline to avoid waking statues. The vizier appears without announcement, stepping into the room like a footnote dressed in beige. He holds a short scroll, still warm from the hands of the pottery messenger, who ran it over from the artisan's compound with what one assumes was an apologetic gait. Your radiance. The vizier says his voice, already measured for sunrise acoustics, the Pottery Guild awaits in the Garden of Shapes. They have prepared 3 possible replacements for the ceremonial water of renewal vessel. The original has been reconsidered. You don't ask for details yet. Some things are better observed than described. You rise, dress with the assistance of 2 attendants who specialize in folds and fastenings, and step into your sandals with the quiet understanding that today will not be defined by large crises, but by small decisions, weighted with expectation. The Garden of Shapes is cool in the early light, its stone paths recently swept, and its central fountain burbling in a rhythm that might be a cousin to calm. The pottery delegation stands in formation near a trio of plinths, each bearing a vessel under a silk cover. They bow as you approach, synchronizing like reeds in a practiced breeze. The head potter, an elderly woman named Tamare, who speaks slowly, even when surprised, steps forward and gestures to the first vessel. She uncovers it. The shape is elegant, but undeniably wide. A fluted rim curves outward, like a serving platter that regrets its ambition, and the inner bowl is deep enough to host both water and questions. You stare at it, then at her. "We were inspired," she says, "by the flow of generous rivers and the open embrace of the Nile's bounty." You nod gently. It is a good bowl, possibly an excellent one, but it lacks the verticality required by a ritual that calls for water to be lifted skyward without risking spillage onto the high priest's sandals. The second vessel is revealed. This one is tall, slender, and carries itself with a kind of amphora-like dignity. It is textured with carvings of gently overlapping waves, and its handles are positioned in such a way that one might imagine it being passed gracefully during an offering. Tamare explains that it was modeled on the ancient vases used during the era of confident pouring, a period known for bold water movements and minimal sloshing. You examine it closely. It is stately, but there's a sharpness to the rim, a design decision likely appreciated in sculpture, but less so when carried by trembling acolytes. You motion toward the third. The final vessel is perhaps the most modest of the three. No elaborate design, no decorative etching. Its shape is that of a simple urn, slightly rounded at the base and tapering toward the mouth with two low handles positioned for easy lift. It is made of polished clay that catches the morning light just enough to look thoughtful. Tamare does not speak this time. She simply waits. You reach out gently and touch the vessel's edge. It is cool, balanced, unremarkable in the way certain moments become unforgettable not for their decoration, but for their fitness. This one, you say, let it hold the water of renewal. Let simplicity carry the meaning. The Pottery Guild bows. Tamaret allows herself a nod, not of pride, but of alignment. The vizier makes a mark on his slate, then gently clears his throat. The high priest of purification has sent word, he says, inquiring whether the water drawn for the renewal should originate from the temple well or the basin of night's reflection. Both are pure. One is traditional. The other has recently been filtered through a bed of volcanic sand and has garnered attention for its unusually calm surface. You consider. The temple well is time-honored, deeply blessed, and slightly mineral-rich. The basin, however, has become quietly popular among younger priests and festival guests seeking symbolic stillness. Both offer clarity, but in different shades. You instruct that the water be drawn from the basin of night's reflection. Let the renewal begin with calm, you say. Let the clarity be visible. The vizier nods. As the decision is carried away by messengers, one on foot, one on donkey, you remain a moment longer in the garden, watching the rising sun catch the edges of the chosen vessel. The light bends gently over its curve, as if agreeing. From somewhere nearby, a servant announces that breakfast has been set in the eastern gallery. A meal of roasted barley, flat bread, date paste, and a cautious selection of dried fruit, chosen not to interfere with speeches. You eat slowly, knowing that after breakfast comes the rehearsal of the procession's turning point, the moment when the torchbearer pivots under the arch of transitional meaning. The arch itself has been reinforced overnight after someone noted a worrying creak. A new support beam has been added discreetly behind a decorative frond. And as you rise to leave your meal, the vizier approaches once more with a fresh scroll. There is a new concern, he says, without blinking. The official feather. Tossers have requested clarification regarding wind direction, as the ceremonial release may cause feathers to drift into the sacred torch path. They suggest angling the toss or dampening the feathers slightly. The vizier says the word feathers with such gravity that it almost sounds like a weather phenomenon. You look at the scroll. It is not long nor urgent, but it bears the faint marks of 3 different signatures, each belonging to a senior feather tosser, each written in a different ink, one brown, one pale yellow, and one so faint it appears as a polite whisper. The scroll outlines the situation in measured detail. The feather toss, which marks the ceremonial midpoint of the festival of light and slight hesitation, must occur precisely as the torchbearer passes under the arch of transitional meaning. The feathers, 5 in number, always odd, never pluralized in speech, must be released with open palms and upward flicks, symbolic of offering grace and general approval of upwardness. However, the direction of the morning breeze has shifted, not dramatically, but just enough to potentially carry the feathers sideways into the sacred torch path. This, the scroll insists, could result in either momentary obscuration or a brief but symbolically problematic contact between fire and floating softness. 2 possible solutions are proposed. The first, by Chief Tosser Nesut, involves angling the toss 2 degrees southward and training the throwers to compensate using wrist finesse. This option, while requiring a brief retraining session and potential changes to the ceremonial elbow, sashes, preserves the dryness and loft of the feathers. The second, supported by senior assistant tosser Ketep, suggests lightly misting the feathers with temple water to reduce lift, causing them to descend more directly. This method carries the advantage of control, but raises concerns about symbolism, specifically whether dampened feathers still carry the proper connotation of liberated joy. You consider both options as you walk slowly toward the arch of transitional meaning, where the torchbearer now stands in solitary practice, pivoting with such care that it appears he is turning not just his body, but a metaphor. The arch itself has been decorated overnight with garlands of reed and pressed lotus, all of which sway subtly in the same direction as the questionable breeze. The feather tossers, in full regalia, await nearby, each holding a practice feather and wearing the slightly furrowed expressions of those who live at the intersection of precision and pageantry. You greet them with a nod, and Nesut steps forward. He is short, deliberate in his movements, and speaks with the certainty of someone who has never mistossed. Your radiance, he says, we can correct for the wind. We've trained for gusts, eddies, and the updrafts of premonition. All we need is elbow clearance and wrist autonomy. Ketep approaches taller and more subdued, but if the breeze grows stronger, he says even precision may not suffice. A single stray feather near flame could become not only disruptive, but ironic. You request a demonstration. 5 dry feathers are brought forth and released according to the traditional toss, each flicked upward in a synchronized movement so well practiced it seems choreographed by the moon. The feathers ascend, drift slightly to the east, and one brushes the edge of the torch path before settling onto the procession stones with a dignity normally reserved for swans. Next, 5 dampened feathers are produced. Each glistens faintly, not wet, but deliberately de-lofted. The toss is more subdued, the arc shorter, and the descent almost vertical. None stray, none flutter, but the gesture lacks its usual flourish. It feels hesitant. You stand in silence, the torchbearer halting his pivot to observe. You glance at the arch, the wind, the feathers. Then you speak. Angle the toss, you say. Let the feathers fly, but wisely. We do not douse what was meant to rise. Let the gesture adapt, not shrink. Nesut bows deeply triumphant, without gloating. Ketep accepts the decision with grace, and immediately begins adjusting the ceremonial elbow sashes with quiet resignation. The feather tossers retreat to rehearse, flanked by 2 assistants, adjusting the toss perimeter with measuring cords and polished pebbles. You remain a moment longer, beneath the arch, watching the sunlight slant through its upper gap and settle briefly on your shoulder. The wind stirs once more, playful but compliant. From a distance, the vizier approaches again, a familiar scroll in hand. The platform planners have submitted a new drawing, he says. There is a growing concern that the seating arrangement for the festival's closing address may result in sun exposure for the high scribe and shadow discomfort for the Guild of Fragrance artisans. They suggest either rotating the platform by 6 degrees or replacing the 4th row with citrus trees. You nod. Of course they do. You accept the scroll and begin walking back toward the planning pavilion, where a clay model of the seating structure awaits complete with miniature figurines representing guilds and dignitaries. Each figure is carved with slight exaggeration to reflect their ceremonial height and preferred posture. The citrus tree option has been modeled with such enthusiasm that one of the miniature fruits has rolled off the platform and now lies beside a tiny pair of priestly sandals. You lift the figure representing the high scribe and rotate it to face a different direction. Then, with a slow and deliberate hand, you tilt the entire model platform 6 degrees to the west. The shadow cast by the temple's outer columns now falls evenly between all parties. Let this be the shape, you say. Let the address begin in balance. A planner scribes the adjustment into the official layout, while a small chorus of sandal-clad aides rush to inform the tree supplier of the new non-requirement. The vizier allows himself a breath. You are about to return to your chamber for the mid-morning stillness when a junior courier appears at full jog, barely stopping in time to bow and produce a tightly bound scroll bearing the crimson seal of the Royal Animal Coordinator. Your Radiance. He pants. There is an issue with the ceremonial ibis. It appears she has taken flight prematurely. The courier does not exhale until you take the scroll from his outstretched hands. His sandals are damp with dew and poorly tied, suggesting a level of haste normally reserved for meteorological disturbance or public sneezing during sacred chants. The crimson seal of the Royal Animal Coordinator is pressed into the wax with unusual depth, as though its sender hoped that pressure might translate into urgency. You break the seal and unroll the parchment. The message is short, clearly written in a moving litter, judging by the mild slope of the lines. The ceremonial ibis. Her clarity, feathered ambassador of still skies and ritual grace, has apparently taken flight 3 hours ahead of schedule. According to the coordinator, she was resting peacefully in her temporary enclosure near the Garden of Reverent Water when a particularly enthusiastic sunbeam reflected off a bronze water dish and triggered what appears to have been an instinctive skyward response. She flew in a northeasterly arc, described by the attending acolyte as confident and unusually narrative, vanishing from sight shortly thereafter. The scroll concludes with the coordinator's humble request for guidance on whether a substitute bird should be deployed, or if the festival must proceed symbolically unfeathered. You sigh not audibly, but internally, the kind of sigh that places a small stone of appreciation for birds inside your ribcage, and then politely covers it with a layer of ceremonial cloth. The ibis's role, though brief, is essential. At precisely midday during the silent pause of celestial alignment, she is released from the central platform to mark the transition between speech and offering. Her flight path, historically unpredictable, yet consistently dignified, symbolizes the ephemeral nature of mortal ambition, rising toward divine indifference. You begin walking toward the royal aviary, located in the shaded east wing of the palace, where air moves slowly and feathers drift without needing encouragement. The vizier follows already, composing potential responses to questions no one has yet asked. When you arrive, the atmosphere is hushed, as though the remaining birds understand that one of their own has broken protocol. The royal animal coordinator, a short man named Hebini, who wears robes with feather motifs so subtle they only reveal themselves under moonlight, greets you with a bow. His expression hovers somewhere between apology and ornithological awe. "Your radiance," he says softly. Her clarity's departure was swift, but elegant. She flew true. It was meaningful. You nod slowly. There are two backup birds, as always. One is a younger ibis still in training, known among the staff as slightly puzzled. The other is an older bird named Lenka, experienced, but known for occasionally pausing mid-flight to inspect things. You step into the enclosure. Slightly puzzled eyes you, with the gaze of one who recognizes authority, but questions its dietary policies. Lenka tilts her head, preens once, then resumes standing on one leg with theatrical balance. Hebeni clears his throat. Lenka would fly with elegance if she chooses to fly at all. The younger bird might start strong, but may veer toward reflective surfaces. You ponder the options. Symbolism is not just about success. Sometimes it's about effort. You instruct that Lenka be prepared. Let her take the sky. If she wills it, you say. If she pauses, let the pause be part of the message. Hebeni bows deeply and signals to an attendant to retrieve Lenka's ceremonial ankle ring. The vizier leans in slightly. Shall I have scribes prepare an alternate interpretation in case of low-altitude symbolism? You nod. Have them prepare 3. one for full flight, one for a pause, one for a return. Outside the festival, procession continues to assemble. Drummers rehearse in the square, their patterns growing steadier with each repetition of the rhythm of absence. The torchbearer, now fluent in the inverted path, adjusts his grip with the focus of a man who has dreamt of angles. The feather tossers, newly calibrated, stretch their wrists like dancers preparing for wind. As you pass through the palace, walk of measured insight, a servant offers you a shallow dish of chilled melon and spiced date slices. You accept one not for hunger, but to acknowledge effort. The festival platform now gleams under the sun's slow climb, its garlands precisely symmetrical, and its citrus-themed row of not quite needed trees placed decoratively along the spectator's edge, just in case. The high scribe arrives with a set of parchment leaflets bearing her speech for the address of converging intents. She asks whether the phrase, "as steady as the ibis flies," should be retained. You pause, then suggest she change it to "as honest as the ibis chooses," which, while vaguer, holds more current relevance. Word arrives soon after from a lookout stationed atop the temple of unfinished proportions, her clarity. The original ibis was seen flying west over the reservoir of intentional reflection. She was not flapping with urgency, but rather gliding with what the observer described as the calm of a bird, with no schedule. You ask that no effort be made to retrieve her. Let her journey be hers. Let the festival reflect what remains. And as the sun reaches its highest point, the platform of central gesture begins to fill with the chosen few. You rise from your seat of deliberation and step on to the ceremonial stones, sandals brushing against the reed-strewn path that leads to the heart of the day's expression. The crowd quiets, the drums still. The choir hums the beginning of a chant that now ends in suspended thought. Lenka, cradled in the arms of Hebene, is brought to the center. Her wings flutter once. She considers the sky. All eyes wait not in demand, but in willing uncertainty. She hops forward, flaps twice, and lifts not high, but with intent curving gently above the arch. The crowd breathes in, and just as her flight steadies, a new messenger approaches from the back edge of the square robes, dusty scroll in hand. Your radiance. He whispers word has arrived from the south granary. There has been a small but notable mislabeling of festival grain. Some of the bread intended for symbolic purity was made using the barley of casual use. You do not react outwardly to the news, because by the 14th ceremonial complication of a festival day, the face of a pharaoh becomes less a canvas of emotion and more a polished surface for projecting calm inevitability. The messenger, a young man whose sandals still bear the square impressions of rushed travel over grain storage grids, holds out the scroll with both hands, as if it might change weight upon reading. You accept it and unroll the message slowly, buying time that cannot be bought, scanning the symbols with an eye now trained for urgent normalcy. The issue is clear and not unprecedented. A clerk in the South Granary, in a moment of entirely understandable distraction, possibly due to an unusually opinionated pigeon perched on the labeling shelf, has mismarked a series of sacks instead of the designated pure barley of ritual cleanliness, known for its fine texture and pious yield. A batch of common barley, often used for everyday loaves, was baked into the ceremonial bread, meant to accompany the water of renewal during the high priest's silent chew. The mistake was discovered by a scribe with a sensitivity to grain density, who noticed the difference during the pre-offering nibble rehearsal. The scroll concludes with a list of which trays are affected, followed by 3 suggested remedies, each phrased more cautiously than the last. The first suggestion is to halt the procession and replace the bread with fresh loaves baked from verified pure grain. This would require delaying the water of renewal and possibly re-choreographing the choir's standing arrangement, which is already 3 degrees off due to the citrus tree shadows. The second option is to proceed as planned and hope that no one notices. This, though tempting, risks setting a precedent known as the doctrine of casual chewing. The third option suggests acknowledging the mishap, publicly interpreting the mix of grains as a metaphor for unity, mortal imperfection, or agricultural honesty. You walk slowly toward the offering platform, past the choir, now murmuring their 4th stanza with a sincerity unmatched by certainty, past the torchbearer who nods once with the conviction of someone who has successfully pivoted under pressure and toward the loaves. They are arranged in concentric spirals upon an offering table, each scored with the sacred line pattern that denotes sincerity and partial baking. To the untrained eye, all loaves appear identical. To the trained tongue, however, the common barley will reveal itself within 2 chews, possibly 3, if swallowed with humility. The high priest stands nearby, resplendent in robes of ceremonial beige, his hands folded, eyes closed, in pre-chew meditation. You turn to the vizier, who holds a separate scroll, noting the names of all those seated within flavor proximity. You speak softly. Let the bread remain. Add a verse to the address of converging intents. Acknowledge the grain. Let this be the festival of mixed offerings. The vizier raises one eyebrow, the precise width of a single barley grain, but says nothing. A scribe is summoned and begins drafting the verse with haste and poetic neutrality. It reads, "In the blending of harvests, we find the truth of the field, that not all purity is pure, and not all commonness is plain." The verse is approved, recited once, and then twice each time, growing in resonance as the choir adjusts their vowels. The high priest, when informed, opens his eyes, smiles with the knowing look of a man who has eaten many breads and found wisdom in most of them. He nods and gently places his hand upon the nearest loaf. The water of renewal is poured. The bread is lifted. A bite is taken. There is a pause, a quiet, thoughtful chew followed by a nod. The crowd exhales, or rather continues, not inhaling too sharply. Lenka circles above once more, still mid-flight, now joined by a smaller bird that may or may not be the prematurely departed, her clarity returning at a socially appropriate distance. A new note hums from the choir. The rhythm of absence is played on reed and drum, firm, soft nothing firm, and it seems to fit. The wind stirs. A feather drifts, not tossed, but wandering. And just as the loaf-bearing priest prepares to step back into line, another messenger appears, not running, but walking quickly in that careful stride reserved for sensitive updates. He carries no scroll, only a small clay amulet bearing the seal of the Temple of Interpretive Time. He bows low and speaks softly. "Your radiance." He says the sun shadow, measurement, has been recalculated. It seems the festival has overlapped by half an hour into the zone of tentative twilight. There are implications for the timing of the sacred cooling ceremony. You receive the news with the practiced stillness of someone who has just been told that time itself has shifted slightly beneath the feet of hundreds of expectant celebrants, all of whom are presently unaware that they have entered an unscheduled realm of mild, symbolic turbulence. The messenger from the Temple of Interpretive Time remains bowed, his amulet tilted slightly, as though reluctant to be involved. The zone of tentative twilight, as you know, is not a dramatic time of day. It's not a sudden darkness or celestial event. Rather, it's a thin slice of overlapping sunlight and ceremonial shade that occurs when solar alignment deviates just enough from the festival calculations of acceptable glow. It is neither day nor evening, neither sacred noon nor divine dusk, but a liminal sliver of chronological ambiguity. Most years, it passes unnoticed, its implications buried beneath sunbeams and well-timed chants. But this year, due to a minor recalibration of the sundial atop the temple of gradual incline, the festival has overrun into it by 32 minutes. And now, as a result, the sacred cooling ceremony, intended to begin precisely at the end of the sun's peak, is technically late or early, depending on which version of the time-aware scrolls one consults. The cooling ceremony. A modest yet symbolically vital ritual involves the lowering of ceremonial fans by the chosen attendants of breath, the distribution of chilled, mint-infused cloths to honored guests, and a group exhalation meant to represent the transition from divine inspiration to contemplative perspiration. Missing the window for this rite could be interpreted as a disregard for symbolic thermodynamics. You look skyward. The light has softened, but not enough to cause alarm. The shadows stretch now with tentative confidence, unaware they are early, or perhaps too timely. You speak to the vizier, who is already fanning himself with the backside of a scroll, detailing acceptable cloth dampness ratios. Have the cooling ceremony proceed, you say, but acknowledge the ambiguity. Let it be performed in recognition, not denial. The vizier nods and dispatches a herald with a bell tuned specifically to tonal uncertainty. Within minutes, the attendants of breath appear, each holding a large fan shaped like the leaf of a contemplative tree, moving in slow arcs designed to suggest breezes without imposing them. The honored guests are handed the mint cloths, pre-soaked, wrung with solemnity, and folded into quadrants that represent the 4 thoughtful corners of the world. As the group exhalation begins, led by a flautist who plays a note so low it can only be heard by furniture, a gentle wind passes through the courtyard, unexpected, unplanned, and entirely welcomed. A priest murmurs, "The gods exhale with us," and several attendees nod, with the sort of vague agreement that makes for good murals later. As the fans rise and fall in their practiced rhythm, you notice that the crowd's mood shifts, not dramatically, but with the soft recalibration of people who have realized that not all timing is precision, that some moments arrive askew but land correctly. The choir, sensing the shift, adds a 5th note to the suspended chant, still unresolved, but now threaded with faint understanding. You turn slightly to regard the central altar, where a line of scribes begins adjusting tomorrow's ceremonial schedule with charcoal and deep sighs. You know the next event is the procession of mutual appreciation, during which dignitaries from various guilds walk side by side through the avenue of slight bows, exchanging compliments crafted to sound humble yet memorable. The compliments are pre-approved, submitted in advance, and carved into small wooden plaques for easy reference. But now a murmur arises from a young protocol attendant who approaches the vizier with what appears to be a slightly smudged list. The list, it seems, has been dampened during cloth distribution. The ink has blurred. Several of the plaques no longer contain legible compliments, but instead abstract shapes and what might be mistaken for cautious sarcasm. You are handed one. It says, "Your trade smells of confidence." Another says, "Your sandals echo wisely." Neither is offensive, but both could cause confusion if read aloud in the wrong tone. The scribe responsible for drying the ink before distribution is already standing very still near a column. You hold up a plaque. "Let them carry the unreadable," you say. Let the appreciation be improvised. Let the avenue of slight bows become a path of authentic invention. The decision is announced. The crowd stirs, laughter. The gentle kind that follows, permission, rolls through the assembly. The guild representatives prepare. One straightens his belt of ceremonial thread. Another adjusts her hair loop into a symbol of uncertain enthusiasm. As the procession begins, you stand quietly watching as guild after guild steps onto the avenue. A potter turns to a carpenter and says, "Your joints withstand metaphor." A brewer nods to a perfumer and says, "The way you layer, scent. It makes bread want to dance." There are smiles, shrugs, occasional missteps. The slight bows vary in depth and sincerity, but the street fills with the kind of movement that murals can only hope to exaggerate properly. As the sun continues its soft descent and the ambiguity of time begins to recede, another messenger approaches. This one is older, his scroll wrapped in blue ribbon with a wax seal shaped like a tiny scale. He bows deeply, then says, "Your radiance, a matter from the hall of weights." It concerns the sacred balance used to measure symbolic fairness. It seems it has tilted ever so slightly left. The scroll is handed to you with a solemnity usually reserved for the misplacement of divinely sanctioned spoons. The messenger from the hall of weights keeps his eyes respectfully lowered, as though the mere mention of imbalance might cause the surrounding architecture to list gently to one side. You untie the blue ribbon, noting that the wax seal, delicately shaped like a scale held by an expressionless bird, has smudged slightly in the midday warmth. The scroll within details the matter plainly. During the routine post-processional inspection of the sacred balance, the bronze indicator that should remain centered between the twin dishes of fairness and prudence was observed to lean by approximately the width of a beetle's antenna toward prudence. Not dramatically, not offensively, but unmistakably. The scale, originally forged during the Year of Agreeable Measures, is housed in the Hall of Weights and used once annually to symbolically confirm that the festival has achieved equilibrium between tradition and thoughtful improvisation. It is not, strictly speaking, used for actual measurements, having been deemed too metaphorical for commerce. Still, its reading is announced with ceremonial clarity by the keeper of moderate judgments, whose voice is said to be equal parts sand and song. A tilt toward prudence could suggest that the festival has veered slightly toward caution, perhaps the result of the dampened feathers, the second choice ibis, the barley compromise, or the delayed cooling. The implications, though symbolic, are enough to prompt a full consultation. You proceed toward the Hall of Weights, a quiet stone chamber, where every object has been placed deliberately, and where even dust seems to settle in symmetrical patterns. The sacred balance sits on its pedestal, surrounded by low candles and a faint smell of polished copper. Two assistants stand guard with measuring reeds and the kinds of expressions that suggest they are not easily amused. The keeper of moderate judgments approaches and bows with the slow grace of someone whose every movement is calibrated. Your radiance, he says, we have rebalanced twice, using the traditional whisper and the corrective feather. Still, the tilt persists. It does not increase. It simply remains. You examine the balance. The left dish, marked with the sigil of prudence, is slightly lower than the right, marked for tradition. The indicator needle points left of center by a margin barely visible unless one has spent a great deal of time looking at still things very carefully. Have the weights been altered, you ask? The keeper shakes his head. Each was inspected this morning. The weight of shared intent. The weight of consequence. Lightened by thought. The counterweight of good humor. All present and within limits. You consider the possibility of environmental factors. The stone base is level. The room is still. The only breeze present is metaphorical. You reach out and gently touch the bronze casing of the scale, not to fix, but to feel. It is warm, familiar, steady, despite its lean. You step back. Let the tilt remain, you say. Let the reading be recorded. A year tilted toward prudence is not a failure, but a reflection. We have adjusted. We have chosen carefully. Let the people know. The keeper nods. A scribe inscribes the tilt into the festival ledger using a pen with a tip shaped like a balanced leaf. The reading will be announced during the closing statements of circumspect victory. It will be described not as an error, but as a moment of considered guidance. The crowd outside, still milling pleasantly in the post-processional glow, accepts the news with nods and the occasional thoughtful noise. One man leans toward another and mutters, "Last time it leaned right, my sandals wore uneven." The vizier appears once more, scroll in hand. He clears his throat gently. "There is another matter," he says. "The Guild of Temple Bakers has presented their final offering, a loaf intended to represent the spirit of this year's celebration. However, it has been shaped in the likeness of a reclining crocodile. Some are unsure whether this reflects reverence or indigestion. You suppress the urge to sigh. Bread in the shape of animals is not uncommon during festive cycles, but the reclining crocodile occupies a liminal space between sacred guardian and midday nap. The loaf itself, currently displayed beneath a modest canopy in the festival courtyard, is indeed impressive. The scales are scored with meticulous care. The tail curves with what can only be described as flair, and the eyes are rendered in raisin. Several attendees are already gathered around it, unsure whether to bow or break off a piece. You approach and observe the loaf in person. It exudes an air of calm, slightly smug starchiness. The baker, a tall man with flour on his elbows, bows deeply. "Your radiance," he says, "this is the offering loaf of tempered boldness." We sought to reflect the festival's character, unexpected, steady, and perhaps slightly chewy. You nod slowly. The loaf does resemble the mood of the day, not triumphant, but thoughtful, not roaring, but very much present. You decree that the loaf shall be honored, named officially in the festival record, and then sliced and shared during the final gathering of artisans. Let them eat the loaf of cautious contentment, you say. Let the flavor be a reminder. A cheer, soft and uncertain, rises from the courtyard. The vizier now walking beside you, as the sun begins to lean, like the scale prepares to speak again. "A final item," he says, though you know better than to believe it's final. The evening lamps have been delayed. The oil guild reports that the scented oil intended for twilight lighting has thickened. It now burns unevenly with flickers interpreted by some as emotional turbulence. The words emotional turbulence, coming from the vizier, are spoken with such stoic reluctance that you briefly wonder if the scented oil has been consulted directly. He unfurls the scroll from the oil guild, a narrow piece of parchment spotted faintly with residue, as if the message had been written hastily upon an oiled surface. The script, neat, but visibly rushed, outlines the problem with unusual poetic flair. The special twilight oil, infused with herbs, meant to evoke calm lavender myrrh, and something they only refer to as contentment root has, over the course of the warm afternoon, thickened beyond the optimal consistency for ritual lamp combustion. When ignited, instead of producing a steady flame, the oil emits a series of flickers, not chaotic, but distinctly variable. These flickers, it appears, are being interpreted by some attendees, particularly those seated near the high platform of end-of-day interpretations, as signs, not flames, but statements. One observer claims to have seen in the flicker a metaphor for missed opportunities. Another described a sudden shift from joy to contemplation to mild hunger. One noble from the Eastern District is convinced that the flickering spelled her name in long form, followed by a gentle critique of her posture. The Oil Guild, dedicated though slightly flustered, has submitted 3 proposed courses of action. First, halt the lighting and substitute traditional unscented oil, which lacks fragrance but burns with dignified plainness. Second, filter the thickened oil using linen cloths and prayerful shaking, hoping for a return to proper consistency. Third, proceed with the flickering and declare it intentional, a celebration of internal nuance, symbolic flame as inner monologue. You are silent for a moment, standing in the corridor between your own thoughts and the increasingly interpretive energy of the crowd. Outside, the lamps have already begun to be lit slowly, one by one, each one catching with a brief struggle, and then a waver. The courtyard, once uniformly golden with dusk, is now mottled with shadows that dance as if telling long, slow jokes to each other. You approach one of the lamps yourself, bending slightly to observe its glow. The flame flutters to the left, hesitates, and then leans right, its light expanding briefly before settling into a heartbeat of light. You straighten and turn to the vizier. Let them flicker, you say. Let the flame reflect what the day has been: uncertain, uneven, meaningful, in ways no scroll can dictate. Add a note to the closing announcements. This year, our light speaks in pauses. The vizier does not protest. He simply nods and moves away to inform the lighting coordinators, who are already surrounded by a small group of observers, attempting to read the flickers as personal revelations. One man clutches a lamp, convinced it has apologized for his childhood. The drums begin again, now softer, more spacious, echoing the flicker rhythm. A few children, unburdened by metaphor, chase the shadows between lamps, laughing when the light sways. The bakers begin to distribute the crocodile loaf in precise slices, each accompanied by a small flag reading "Tempered Boldness," and no one asks what part of the reptile they are receiving. As twilight deepens, the stage is prepared for the ceremonial utterance of almost conclusions. A speech traditionally given not to summarize the festival, but to vaguely nod in its direction. The speaker this year is a historian known for long pauses and footnotes spoken aloud. He mounts the platform with a scroll so long it drags slightly behind him, and the first few words, "As the ibis flies," or sometimes waits, receive a ripple of appreciative murmurs. You remain standing slightly behind the stage, where the torchbearer now leans against a column. His job complete. One elbow still held in the ceremonial angle as a matter of habit. You did well, you tell him. He nods, not quite smiling, but pleased in the quiet way of someone who has pivoted precisely on cue. In the near distance, Lenka, the ibis, has returned to her perch atop the temple of decorative geometry, her flight now complete, her wings tucked in a position known among priests as the rest of fulfilled possibility. A singer clears her throat, preparing for the night's humming, a melody with no words, no written notes, and no designated ending. The crowd hushes. A man in the front row tilts his head toward a flickering lamp, as if hoping for one last insight. Just before the humming begins, a final courier arrives. No scroll this time, only breathless words. Your Radiance, a delegation from the distant Reed Islands, has arrived unannounced. They bring a gift of unusual length and an expectation of immediate acknowledgement. They say it must be displayed before moonrise, or the symbolism loses flavor. You do not flinch, not even slightly, though inwardly you allow yourself the image of a small ceremonial sigh curling up like steam from a teacup held far away. The timing of the delegation from the distant Reed Islands is, as always, almost impressive in its disregard for regularity. Their gifts are rare, wrapped in riddle and reed, and known less for utility than for interpretive volume. You motion for the courier to lead the way, and with the vizier beside you, already unrolling a fresh scroll, with room for diplomatic footnotes, you make your way past flickering lamps and half-hummed night songs toward the western gate, where the delegation awaits beneath a canopy of deeply ceremonial leaves. The distant Reed Islanders are a people of great subtlety, known for speaking through object and gesture more often than through mouth and sound. They are dressed in woven cloaks, the color of patient rivers, their hair adorned with feathers from birds that molt only during eclipses. Their leader, an elder known as Coordinator of Shapes, steps forward and bows in 4 short movements, each corresponding, you recall, to a cardinal direction and a seasonal kind of rain. You return the bow 2 degrees deeper than usual to indicate present readiness. The gift is unwrapped slowly. It takes 4 attendants nearly 5 minutes just to unfurl it fully. It is a scroll, though not of parchment, but of tightly woven reed strands dyed with subtle color variations that, when fully extended, reveal a single, continuous line of undulating shapes. The scroll measures nearly the length of a fishing boat, and at first glance it appears to be a landscape of no particular direction. Hills that are also waves, trees that might be hands, and one long curve that resembles either a path or a thought. The coordinator of shapes speaks softly and with great formality. This is our gift, the timeline of considered paths. It is meant to be viewed before the full rise of the moon. If displayed too late, the line will appear too direct. If viewed in haste, the shapes will imply certainty. Neither is intended. The vizier, already scribbling, leans in. They require placement before moonrise, he murmurs. They fear the implications of flavorless symbolism. You glance at the moon. It is already peaking above the eastern rooftops, climbing with the slow confidence of something sure of its place. Time is narrow. You instruct that the festival's central viewing pavilion be cleared and the timeline displayed along the southern balustrade, where the moonlight will fall first. As the attendants carry the scroll with the delicacy of those who have never carried anything urgent, you follow them through the slowly shifting crowd. Word spreads quickly, and by the time the scroll reaches its perch, a quiet assembly has formed, faces turned toward the line of shapes, waiting to interpret without instruction. You stand back, allowing others to gaze first. The line of the scroll begins to shimmer faintly as the moonlight touches its first hill wave. A child gasps, not loudly, but with the sound of discovery, and points at a bend that looks remarkably like a goose mid-apology. A baker claims he sees a resemblance to the morning's bread. A musician says it mirrors the tune she didn't play. A priest mutters that the central loop perfectly matches the tilt of the sacred balance. The coordinator of shapes watches with serene satisfaction, eyes, closed hands folded in the shape of waiting. You step forward and offer the traditional closing words of reception. Your path has touched our light. We will walk it slowly. The delegation bows their feathers, catching the lamplight in a shimmer that says both goodbye and possibly something about rainfall. As the moon climbs higher and the festival breathes out into the coolness of night, you return to your seat beside the platform. The speech of almost conclusions has ended. The crocodile loaf has been devoured respectfully. The choir hums a sixth note, unplanned, but in key. The vizier appears again, slower now, his sandals whispering across the stone. A final query, he says again, falsely, but kindly. The night curtain, meant to close the official festival, rites, has been prepared. But its draw cord has tangled slightly with the ceremonial wind chimes. If pulled too briskly, there may be unexpected sound. If left untouched, the curtain will remain ajar, and some may question whether the festival ever truly concluded. You stare at the night curtain, still folded in its resting place, near the back of the platform, and it stares back, if such a thing can be said, of thick woven linen, dyed in ceremonial dusk. The curtain dyed using midnight flower pigment and embroidered with the traditional spiral of closure is meant to fall silently at the end of the festival, separating the final moment of formal speech from the long collective breath of departure. But now, due to a moment of well-intended rearrangement by the wind chime harmonization aid, the draw cord has looped itself around the uppermost chime, which happens to be tuned to the note of reflective regret. If the curtain is drawn as intended, it will not glide down in silence as planned, but instead jangle ever so slightly, a sound not disruptive, but definitely interpretive. The vizier, who by now has developed a tone of voice reserved specifically for situations involving knots, looks at the cord with what might be a scholarly frown. Your radiance. He begins. It may be that the sound itself could be recontextualized. You approach the curtain slowly, feeling the weight of the evening settle across the courtyard like a second cloak. Around you, guests have begun to shift from official postures to the more relaxed stance of satisfied ambiguity. Some still gaze at the timeline of considered paths, which now glows softly under the full moon, its reed-dyed hills no longer just symbols, but almost memories. The curtain waits. One option, clearly, is to leave it untouched, let it hang half-closed, a symbol of an ending in progress. Another is to cut the cord quietly and lower it by hand, bypassing both sound and tradition. Or perhaps to draw it fully and let the chime sing, letting the sound become not an error, but an audible footnote. You signal the curtain attendant, a woman known for her precise wrists and poetic silence. She bows and approaches with the kind of caution normally used when handling animals with uncertain moods. If drawn, she says softly, it will ring once, not sharply, just enough to be heard. You nod. Let it ring, you say. Let it remind us that silence is not always silent. Let the ending hum with what remains. The attendant bows again and steps forward. All eyes turn toward her. The draw cord is lifted, gently untangled, as far as prudence allows, and then pulled in one long, smooth motion. The curtain falls. As it does, the chime rings clear, soft, and oddly satisfied. The sound passes through the courtyard like the sigh of a wise pot. No one moves for a breath's length. Then the audience shifts a wave of murmured approval, as if the sound confirmed something they'd suspected about themselves all along. You glance at the vizier. He has written curtain sound embraced in the margin of his ever-thickening scroll. A child claps once. The lamps continue flickering, undecided about extinguishing. The choir hums the unresolved seventh note. The crocodile loaf, or what remains of it, has been placed on a commemorative tray, now surrounded by tiny paper flags that say, "Good effort." All that remains, by traditional design, is the placement of the festival stone, a small oval-shaped piece of polished basalt that is returned to its pedestal at the very end of the event. The stone is not sacred exactly, but is treated with the respect of something that has always been where it is. This year, due to earlier tilts and slight calendrical fog, its placement has been delayed. The stone attendant, an elderly man whose role has passed down through quiet relatives for 3 generations, now approaches with the object in both hands, cradled like a sleepy truth. You take it from him, the weight familiar, and slightly cooler than expected. The pedestal waits in the center of the courtyard, under a moonbeam that has arrived precisely on time for once. As you walk toward it, the crowd quiets again, not in anticipation, but in mutual settling. You lower the stone slowly. It fits. Of course it does. But as your hands lift away, something shifts beneath the pedestal, an unexpected creak of ancient mortar, a settling of ground, a possible metaphor, waiting for confirmation. Then, before anyone can react fully, a faint sound arises from below. A gentle, muffled knocking. Not alarming, just present. As if from beneath the stone, someone has remembered a question. The sound is not loud, nor is it rhythmic enough to provoke alarm. It is more like the soft, methodical tapping of an idea trying to become a memory. Those closest to the pedestal lean in slightly, not out of fear, but in that shared tilt of collective curiosity. The vizier takes a half step forward, and then stops, sensing that any words he might speak would either explain too little or too much. The stone, now seated in its rightful place at the center of the courtyard, glows faintly under the moonlight, just as it has done at the end of every festival, since before records insisted on precision. But tonight, for reasons yet unformed, it hums with the softest suggestion of layered meaning. You remain motionless, letting the sound continue, not summoning priests or scribes, not dispatching messengers or diggers, just listening. The crowd does the same. A few guests close their eyes as if to hear better, with something other than ears. Somewhere near the edge of the garden, a lantern flickers twice, then settles. The knocking does not intensify. It persists, a kind of patience expressed as percussion. The stone attendant, still standing respectfully to the side, clears his throat very quietly, more to acknowledge that something has occurred than to offer solution. It has never done that before he says, his voice dry as woven bark. You offer a faint nod. The stone is not supposed to do anything. That is its entire purpose. It is the object that marks the end, the steady final dot on the long scroll of celebration. But tonight, the dot stirs. Let it be, you say, gently. Let the stone settle in its own time. And so, the final ritual of the festival, the quiet dispersal, the slow re-entry into ordinary night, continues, though, now tinged with something that is not quite confusion and not quite revelation. A new rhythm begins, led not by drum or chant, but by the slow movement of people turning inward, letting questions trail behind them like ceremonial sashes. The choir, sensing the shift, begins to hum once more, not the previous unresolved note, but something lower, broader, as though to ground whatever is gently knocking beneath the basalt. You walk the perimeter of the courtyard, once alone, but not unnoticed. Here and there, celebrants bow their heads, not in deference, but in thought. The timeline of considered paths remains unfurled, now slightly curved, where the night breeze has coaxed the edge. The delegation from the distant Reed Islands has departed without farewell, their message apparently delivered in full. The crocodile loaf is no more, though someone has preserved the raisin eyes in a shallow bowl labeled symbolic reserves. And above the moon hovers silent and appropriately vague, casting enough light to make every shadow just ambiguous enough to seem deliberate. You pass the last flickering lamp and place your hand gently against the cool pillar at the entrance to the gallery of recorded gestures. Behind you, the stone still rests, unmoved, but not unmoving. The knocking continues. Not louder, just there. And so you do not close the scroll. Not yet. You let the page remain open, the ink still drying the silence of the end slightly interrupted by the thoughtful persistence of something beneath. Not an answer, not even a question, just the presence of possibility.